Good morning. It is a pleasure and an honor to be with you today. Jennifer and I drove up from Albert Lea, Minnesota yesterday. That's in the south, for some of you who don't know where that is. But it's about the same temperature as it is here today. And we had a lovely drive. We've never been this far north in Minnesota before, and we were expecting snow, but thankfully for you, probably, you get a break, and it hasn't come yet. But it's coming, right? You're going to get snow, and you're going to get cold. We arrived last evening and had just such a wonderful time with your senior pastor, Kevin and his wife, Allison. And so enjoyed the children that were there, the 4 of 6, Lily and Shauna, and William back there and Colin. We just had a delightful time. And I just love to see how God gives good gifts to his church. And he has given you a very good gift in this family. I also bring greetings from Kevin Complin, president of the Evangelical Free Church of America. It was his desire to be here today. I'm second string today. I don't take that personally, but Kevin was the guy you wanted, and I understand why. Kevin is just a tremendous heart, a tremendous preacher of God's word, a tremendous leader of the Evangelical Free Church of America. I'm so grateful to be able to follow him and to take his lead as he is shaping the Evangelical Free Church of America to multiply transformational churches among all people. And I've heard Kevin give several of his talks many times because we often follow each other in conferences and we're at the same places. And I have heard many stories about Thief River Falls over the years. And I want to tell you, as many times as he might tell a story about his upbringing here, it is always filled with passion and appreciation and great love for what this church provided him in his youth. And so I want to say thank you for that. I also grew up in an evangelical free church, and here's a picture of me a long time ago. My dad there on the left, he was a trustee at that time. In the old days, I don't know if you have trustees anymore, but those are the guys who took care of the stuff of the church. And on the right's my mom. She was the mission chairperson at the time. And the two of them put their heads together and they said, we need a map in the lobby for our missionaries. And so my dad invited me to join a project with him, and he taught me how to use a bandsaw. I think I was 9 years old, and I worked with a bandsaw on a pattern, and I cut out all the continents, cut them out, and then filed them and sanded them, and then we painted them. And that process for me was like the first time that I began to connect with the fact that my mom and dad care about the world, and the church I attend cares about the world, and the Jesus I believe in cares about the world. And here's a picture of the world, and these are people that we have sent out and people we support because we care about the world. And the whole idea of the harvest being ready and needing to be brought in started to take on new meaning for me. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 9 that the harvest field's ready. But the problem is that we don't have enough workers to bring in the harvest. And he said, so ask me and I will thrust out. Not send out. That's a little safe in our English language. The actual word is more of a thrust or a shove. Get out there. The harvest is ready. Ask me and I will thrust out people into the harvest field. As I developed as a pastor, I began to develop convictions and understandings of the scriptures, just being in the practice of being a pastor and learning and studying. And it began to occur to me in my first pastorate that the local church actually doesn't just send out workers into the harvest field, but the local church actually consists of workers. And there's a harvest field right where we're at. And sometimes we think of it as, oh, it's over there, so we got to can some of you leave here and go over there? Well, that's certainly part of it. We call those missionaries, and they're to be honored. They are responding to God's call in marvelous and unique ways to go and live in a different culture and to learn another language and to give decades of their lives to a people that are not their own, but a people that are God's. It's the harvest field. But all of us are called into the harvest field wherever we are at, whatever we are doing. We're called to that harvest field. Jesus calls us there, and he wants to thrust us out into that place where he's put us. That harvest field is for you as a church, is the neighborhood you reside in. It's where you live. It's this city. It's this region. I was so encouraged to hear about you being a good neighbor. last night as Kevin shared with me about this formerly being a school and some of the equipment you have and setup you have that allowed you to say to the public schools in a time of need, hey, can we partner together? Because what you were doing is you're saying, can we be good neighbors? Can we extend love toward you as a local church? Can we love our harvest field for Jesus? And so encouraged my heart. Because I want to talk about what it means to be a good neighbor this morning, just for a few moments. In many ways, I grew up in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and some of you did too. I grew up there. It was my favorite early elementary television show. I loved every part of Mr. Rogers. I loved the land of make-believe with King Friday and all the characters, the visiting of factories to see how things are made, like, oh, that's where donuts come from. Like you learned so much from Mr. Rogers because he took you places. He read me books. I watched him feed the fish every episode. He was responsible. He cared about the fish. And he had honest conversations with kids. He talked about really hard things. On his episodes, he talked about divorce. When Robert Kennedy was assassinated, he made the bold move to talk about assassination, what it is and how it might make you feel as a child. That's amazing. He talked about violence. He talked about death. He talked about racism. Now, obviously, that wasn't all he talked about. He talked about fun stuff too, but he talked about real stuff. And he had conversation with children about real stuff. He was affirming, gentle, caring, loving as he talked with us. Mr. Rogers was a good neighbor, and in one episode in the late 60s, he demonstrated this by doing something bold in the day. It was the late 60s, there was a lot of racial tensions in America, different than today, but not unlike today, okay? There was stress, there was tension, and there was a police officer on the show, a character named Officer Clemens. And Officer Clemens was African American. And Mr. Rogers invited Officer Clemens into the front yard. He said, come on in. Are your feet hot? Why don't you slip your shoes off and let's sit by the kiddie pool in my front yard and let's put our feet in the pool together. It was a big risk for Mr. Rogers at the time, but it had a huge impact. Because he was saying to kids, you know what? This is good. This is okay. We can do this together. We can love each other. We can be good neighbors to each other. And for 30 years, Mr. Rogers epitomized what it meant to be a good neighbor. This morning, we're going to take a few moments to consider one of Jesus' more famous stories about what it means to be a good neighbor. What it means to love people in the harvest field that you are in. The passage is most often referred to as the parable of the Good Samaritan. A parable is a simple story that Jesus would tell. And they weren't unique to Jesus, but Jesus in the Gospels is, of course, known for them. It was a simple story with a significant point, usually a very spiritual point. And so as we look at the passage today, it's found in Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 25. As we look at it, we're going to see it's really two things happening. The first part's a conversation that Jesus is having with a religious expert. And they have a conversation about being a neighbor. And then the second part is Jesus tells the story of what it means to be a good neighbor. So as we look first. I forgot these pictures. There you go. There's Officer Clemens sharing the pool. And 30 years later, Officer Clemens joined him again in the 90s to reprise the visit. It's really two beautiful episodes. And as we look at this first section of Luke chapter 10, I want us to see that Jesus leads us to love as a good neighbor, by asking us some questions. So follow along. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? And the religious expert answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Let's take a look at the passage. The first thing is that we want to note is that the religious expert is asking about, how do I have a great life? Eternal life isn't just about the future, it's about the present, it's about the fullness of God, the blessing of God, the peace of God. It's about these things characterizing our life. And he's saying, how do I have a great life? How do I live a full life right now? What do I do? And Jesus enters into what's called midrash. It's a Jewish technique of challenging and educating people. It's questions and answers. And you just Google midrash sometime and read a little bit about it. And you go, oh, that's what Jesus does all the time in the Gospels. I never understood what he was doing, but here it is. He asks questions. He turns the tables. Jesus does this. And so in Mark and Matthew, when he's asked, what are the greatest commandments? Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor. In this passage, Jesus doesn't give the answer. In this passage, Jesus is asked, what do I need to do to have a full life? And Jesus says, will you tell me what you think? You're a religious expert in the law. How would you answer that question? So he turns the tables. And so the religious expert says, well, love God and love your neighbor. And Jesus says, you're right. He gets it right. It's the Sunday school answer. That's not a bad answer. I'm just saying it's the Sunday school answer. It's the answer everybody knows. There was not anything particularly remarkable about that answer. These kinds of discussions were happening among the Jews all the time in Jesus' day. And so he gets the answer right. Love God and love other people. And these are rooted back into the Old Testament scripture. Deuteronomy 6:5 is where it says we're to love God with all of our being. And then in Leviticus 19, verses 18 and 34, we're told to not only love our neighbors, but to love the foreigner among us as if they are our neighbors. And he's just saying, that's what the scriptures are saying to us. Have a full life if you love God and you love your neighbor. And Jesus says, you're right. So go do it. Go do that and live, Jesus says. You'll have a full life if you do that. You're right. Go do it. At this point, the religious leader, though, pauses. I can imagine a pause there. We're not told that in the text, but you have a sense that maybe there's a pause. And perhaps a desire, well, we're told, a desire to justify himself. Because perhaps he's thinking to himself, okay, I got the right answer, but you know what? I really don't like some of my neighbors. I don't love some of my neighbors. I wonder if there's a loophole. Is there a technical use of the term neighbor here that would allow me to love certain people but not other people? He's aware in his own heart that he does not love all his neighbors. He loves some of his neighbors. He loves neighbors that he agrees with, neighbors who keep their yard neat and clean, neighbors whose political yard signs are maybe the same as his political yard signs. Those are the neighbors I want to love. I don't have to love the other neighbors, do I? And he's looking for a way to get out of the fact that he doesn't love everybody, and he knows that the Bible says, yeah, you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. So the religious expert says, who is my neighbor? I can give the right answer to the question, so can you. I mean, the question, how do you have a fullness of life? Love God, love people. We talk a lot about that. We can give that answer, but do we do it? Is my heart always there? Are my actions reflective of what I know is the right Sunday school answer? I live in a bubble, just like all of you. I live in a bubble called James Petersen. I live in a bubble of my marriage. I live in a bubble of my family. I live in a bubble of my yard and home, my neighborhood. I live in a bubble with friends. I live in a bubble with church. I live in a bubble at work. Okay, you know what I mean, a bubble? It's a place where I know everybody, I know the rules, I know how things work, and I'm reasonably comfortable and at ease. That doesn't mean every bubble's perfect, but I kind of know the people I'm hanging with. I know where the landmines are. I know how to avoid certain issues I don't want to deal with. And most often those bubbles can be just wonderful, delightful places. And the fact is we all need to go to a bubble once in a while for comfort and ease and safety and security. There's a kind of a bubble here today, and it's good. I feel at home with you. Even though I don't know you, there is a common belief system here. There's a common history. There's things enough in common that means we're together in something. This is a kind of a big bubble today. So we all live in these kinds of bubbles, and bubbles aren't bad. But bubbles, if we stay in them, can be bad. Bubbles, if we escape from responsibility, can be bad. Bubbles, if we avoid difficult situations, can be bad. And the reality, when you're in a safe, secure place with people you know and have similar beliefs, whether they be theological beliefs or political beliefs or NFL beliefs or Big Ten beliefs, whatever. Why do you want to hang out with Viking fans when you watch a Viking game? There's a bubble, and it feels good to be with people who have a passion like you do. So bubbles are good, but they can become a place of escape. They can become a place of avoidance. They can keep us from actually loving God and loving others and not realizing the fullness of life that comes with these commands. A few years back, Jennifer and I realized that we'd been giving so much attention to the local church, and we should, it was my job, and so nobody's questioning that, but I realized that I was so much in the life of the church that I was losing touch with the neighborhood, with the world, with the city I lived in. I was like, what could I do once a week or once a month just to get out with people who don't believe like I do, people who would never come to the church, people who don't even care that I'm a pastor? You know, where is that place? And I'm an artist. I love to create art, and I had joined the arts community in Albert Lea, became part of the discussion of a new arts building and the next art show, and started to show my art and share my art and receive others. And you know, it became a really cool place, but initially it wasn't for me. Initially it was very uncomfortable. Initially it was kind of scary, and I met people who were unkind. I met people who were thoughtless, hurtful, irritating, obnoxious. I met some really arrogant artists. And you know what? I can be that kind of person too sometimes. And we all can, but in the life of the church, we've learned how to contain that, and we know that you don't bring that out here. Keep that in the box, because that doesn't play well at church on Sunday morning. But the reality is, in our hearts, inside of us, we have some of those same things that we don't like in other people, and we look down on other people for. And so now I'm in a place where I'm in a new space, a new bubble, and I'm experiencing things that are uncomfortable. But that new bubble forced me out of a comfortable bubble so that I could begin to experience people that I normally don't interact with. Jennifer and I, as a couple then, decided that we would partner with the local Catholic church. That's outside my bubble. The Catholic church, ministering with the Catholic church. How does that work? Do I theologically agree with them? Actually, what we did was we said they have a soup kitchen that operates every Monday, feeds the hungry of Albert Lea, and they're always looking for volunteers. We can go help feed people. We're not running it. We're not in charge of it. Nobody needs to know who we are. We just are going to go in, and we're going to make food, and we're going to wash pots and pans, and we're going to put out napkins and drinks, and we're going to care for about 40 to 50 homeless people, not homeless, hungry people that come through there every Monday evening for supper. And we were with people who didn't have cars. They had to walk there. I don't know too many people who don't have a car. But after that, I did. people that needed public transportation to get to the doctor, but we don't even have public transportation in Albert Lea. So I was all of a sudden exposed to things that were not in my bubble. They were new, and frankly, a bit uncomfortable, kind of scary at times. But it was important in order for me to get outside of where I'm most comfortable so that I could begin to say, okay, in this new space, which is a harvest field, how do I love God here and how do I love these people here so that I can have the fullness of life, so that I can experience life with God on a whole new level because I'm engaging people in the harvest with love. Maybe the love bubble needs to pop for some of us because we're just in that little place with people we love, and we need to get out of that place so we can love people that are harder to love. And the expert of the law knows this. He knows that he falls short. He knows that there are people he doesn't want to love. He knows he's avoiding certain things. He knows he expects certain things. And so this first section ends with him saying, "Who is my neighbor?" We move from Jesus leading us to love by asking us questions, because he says, hey, tell me what the Bible says. And we say, love God, love people. And he says, you're right, now you got to do it. But who is my neighbor? And the next thing Jesus does is he leads us to love by telling us a story. He leads us to love our neighbors by telling us a story. So follow along, Luke chapter 10, beginning with verse 29. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place, he saw him pass by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have. Then he looks at the crowd and the religious expert and says, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the expert of the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and live that way. Go and be like that guy. The distance from Jerusalem to Jericho is 24 miles. The elevation drop is 1 mile. You go from 2,600 feet where Jerusalem is to 824 feet below sea level where Jericho is. So it's a pretty incredible drop. It's a very rocky, rugged area. There's no vegetation anywhere. It's just rocks and dust and some sand. Very barren. I've had a chance to walk parts of that trail, that ancient trail. Nobody uses that specific trail anymore, but it's still there. And it is very rugged. It's very desolate. It's very isolated. It would be very easy for people with ill intent to hide in corners and caves and to attack a lone traveler, which is exactly what happened here. This lone traveler was attacked and viciously beaten and left for dead. There's 3 people who come along upon this situation, this man who's close to death. The first one is a priest, and the priest was one who worked in the temple of God. He was like a worship leader. The Levite was the Levite was the second person who came by. They were like a support to the priest, a support to the Cohen. And they're kind of like your sound crew, your tech crew. Okay? So you got one who's like leading the worship and one who's supporting the worship. So you have coming out of Jerusalem where the temple was, a priest who has finished his time of leading worship in the temple, and he's on his way home to Jericho. And you have then a tech crew guy who's done making things happen in Jerusalem at the temple, and he's now on his way down the hill. These are people who love God. They love their neighbor. They understand the scriptures, and they're both on their way down the hill, but as they individually come to this incredible need on the road, they move across the road. They stay in a bubble of comfort and ease and safety and security because that's uncomfortable. That's hard. I don't want to do that. And so they move around the individual, the priest first, and then next the Levite moves around the individual and goes on down the road. The third person who comes, the third person is a Samaritan. And we listen to the action in the story, just the verbs here. The Samaritan goes to the man. Okay, the other two avoided, went around the man. The Samaritan goes to the man, bandages the man, cleans the man, puts the man on his mule, takes the man to the inn, and provides the man for the man's comfort and care. Look at all of the Samaritans, like boom, 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 boom. The other two guys were like, no, 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 no. The Samaritan gets it. He's right there. And what's significant really for us to recognize is the Samaritan, theologically and historically, the Samaritans were arch enemies with the Jews. And the Jews were arch enemies with the Samaritans. They didn't like each other, they hated each other. Samaritans and Jews never got along. And now what happens is Jesus is telling this story, and he's making the enemy of the Jews the hero of the story. Because the Samaritan does absolutely the right thing. And we need to hear that in order to understand what's really going on here. That Jesus this isn't just a nice story. This is a story. One person said it, this is a story like a rope running through a loophole, and the fact that this guy's a Samaritan is like a knot. And when it comes to the loophole, it jerks our attention. It snaps our head. Now we don't feel that because we don't have any thing with Jews or Samaritans. We don't have. So I want you to imagine being in your living room. Last night, Jesus was there, and you asked him, "Who's my neighbor?" And he told you this story. But here's how the hero part went. Because he contextualized. He didn't use Samaritan. He said to you, and he knows. Okay, bear with me. He knows you happen to be maybe a Democrat. And he says, this guy by the name of Donald Trump came along and saved this guy. Or maybe you're a Republican. He went to your house next, and he recognized maybe, oh, they're Republicans. So he tells a story, he says, and then Joe Biden came along and saved this guy. You're like, rats. I don't want him to be the good guy in the story. No, I don't want that. This is real, right? This is real. This is heightened. This is tension in our culture. That's what it was here. It was heightened tension. And Jesus actually says, no, the good guy here is the guy that you all hate. Now, let me give you an example of hate. Okay, Luke chapter 9. Few verses before this story, listen to what Luke tells us here. As the time approached for Jesus to be taken up to heaven, he resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village. Now, in order to get from Galilee to Jerusalem, you have to go through Samaria. And so Jesus is headed from point A to point B. He's got to go through Samaria, sends people ahead into a Samaritan village, okay, to get things ready for him. But the people in that village, the Samaritans, did not welcome Jesus because he was heading to Jerusalem. They worshiped somewhere else. They're like, you guys are all losers because you go to Jerusalem to worship. You should come and worship where we do. It was that kind of animosity. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, When James and John, brothers, right, friends of Jesus, part of the big three of Jesus' gang, they're seeing this. The Samaritans are rejecting Jesus, okay? What do? Think about it. What do? Maybe you know the story. They say to Jesus, they ask him, Jesus, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them? You think about that. They were unwelcomed at a village, and the disciples are like, you want us to burn this Samaritan village to the ground? And Jesus is like, it says he rebuked them. I'd love to hear that. I'd love to know the tone. And was it just a look, or was it a finger shake? Or he was like, are you guys crazy? Do you not get who I am and why we're here? I mean, I don't know what the rebuke was, but they were rebuked. Okay, so then, that just happened, let's say. Okay, it just happened, and now Jesus is telling a story, and as he makes the Samaritan a hero, I have to believe he's kind of looking through there's James. There's John. James and John, you hearing who the hero of the story is? It's a good Samaritan. The kind of people you wanted to fry a couple hours ago. James and John, that Samaritan is actually a better Jew in that moment than you are. And he's a Samaritan. This is really a strong story. This is just a good story about some guy who helped people. This is about a guy who was a better Jew than the Jews, who actually did the right thing. It's a crazy story. My wife and I had a chance to live in Israel when we were first married. We lived on a kibbutz, an agricultural farm community. We learned modern Hebrew. We worked in the fields. We did agriculture. Jennifer worked with children. It was just a tremendous experience. And on one of our first kind of times off, we got on a bus, we went to Jerusalem, and we went to the Jaffa Gate, and we entered in. And as we're entering, a Palestinian man approached us, and I knew he was Palestinian by the colors he was wearing. I just knew he was Palestinian. It was clear. And he came over to us, and he said, I see your wife's sandal is separating. You've had that happen, right, with a shoe? It separates the front. It's so annoying, especially if you're touring or walking. He's like, I know someone that can fix that for you. We were 23. We're like newlyweds. I'm like, okay. And just a little nervous, like, didn't know. So we go with him, and he takes us down into the shooks of Jerusalem, and we come to this little window ledge that's a shoe shop, and we give him, and the guy mixes up epoxy and clamps it, and he fixes our shoe. Palestinian, a good Palestinian, who saw my wife's need and said, I can help you with that. Now, maybe he just brought us to help his friend get some business. I mean, okay. But then he says to us, would you come to my home? Okay, now I'm not so sure. Come to my home. I want you to meet my mother and my 3 sisters. Okay, so we did. 23, we said, okay. And we followed him through the maze of these Middle Eastern cities you've seen in movies and pictures, and you get turned around really quick and you don't know which way is north or south or where you came in or it's like this big maze. And all of a sudden we are in a courtyard, pretty tight courtyard with a stairwell that's going up around the interior courtyard. There's no railing. You kind of stay against the wall and these little steps. And we got to the blue door at the top, and he enters and he invites us in. There's his mom in the kitchen. And his 3 sisters sitting on the couch. And they serve us Turkish coffee. And they give us cookies. And they say, welcome to Jerusalem. It blew my mind. And even now I can hear the Spirit whispering, that Palestinian's a better neighbor than you are sometimes. Because when I first saw him, I thought Palestinian problem. When I first saw him, I saw Palestinian danger. I was afraid. He wasn't afraid of me. He was being a good neighbor. At the end of the story, Jesus quizzes the man. So based on the story, my friend, which of the three travelers was the good neighbor? And the religious guy couldn't bring himself to say even the word Samaritan. It's missing in the text. He says the one who showed mercy. He had to answer right. Everybody knew what the right answer was, but he wasn't going to say the word Samaritan. The one who showed mercy. And Jesus said, be like that guy. Be like the Samaritan. What is the need, and how can I help? These are the two questions I just want to leave you with today as we think about this, as we wrap up. What is the need, and how can I help? These are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves on a regular basis as we move through life. Because there's not one checkbox every day that we're looking for to love God, love our neighbors, and have a good life. Oh, I found it today, check. No, there's thousands of check boxes, and all of us are living through life. It starts in the bedroom if you're married. It starts in the kitchen with your family. It continues in the living room. Because they're your neighbors too, right? They're in your bubble, but they're your neighbors. And so what's the need and how can I meet the need? These are questions that we need to be asking ourselves. This is what it means to be a good neighbor and to love others. What is the need and how can I meet the need? Can you just say those with me? What is the need and how can I help? Right? These seems pretty basic and simple, and yet I need to be reminded of that. I need to have that in front of me on a regular basis. And sometimes we think of this as this really big deal, like, oh, I'm never going to run across a guy almost dead on the side of the road, so this doesn't apply to me. No. Although you might someday run across a dead guy on the side of the road. I was 16. I was on my way to a date with a super hot chick who became my wife, okay? She became a woman. Can I say hot chick? I'm sorry. That's how I think of my wife, okay? So she became my wife. I was on my way to a date, 16. I'm on my way. I'm driving down the road, and all of a sudden I see a guy laying on his back on his lawn, and the lawnmower's there, and it's running, and my windows are down. I'm driving a 73 Impala, and I'm like, I hear the lawnmower, and he's not taking a nap. It's not good. And I pull over, and I get out of my car, and as I'm running over to the yard, apparently Mrs. Guy on the lawn comes running out of her house. I mean, she clearly was the wife, but I didn't know. And we met there, and it became apparent really quick he was dead. Mass heart attack while cutting the lawn. Pulse, no pulse, not breathing, tongue blue. It was not good. He was dead. What's the need? How can I help? I'm not a doctor, not a mortician, I'm not a cop, I'm not a police officer. I'm 16 years old. But there's a woman hysterical and crying and doesn't know what to do. So I sat with her. That's all I did. I just sat with her until other neighbors started to come and the ambulance came, and then I just got up and moved away because there were other people that had better offerings than I did. But in that moment, I had something. Sometimes we get distracted by the bigness of this story, like, oh my gosh, he paid for his hotel bills, and I don't have money to do that. And all of a sudden, we're like, oh, this story isn't about me, because I can't do that. Yeah, but that's why the question is, what is the need and how can I help? Maybe you can't pay for all the hotel bills and the medical bills for this guy that's on the side of the road. I was 16. All I could do was sit with a grieving woman at the moment of her husband's death. This is how we're called to live life. We love God, we love others, our neighbors, and out of that comes a fullness of life that God gives us. He says, this is how eternal life comes to you. And I'm not talking about salvation here. That comes by faith in Jesus Christ alone, a recognition of our sin and our separation from God, and a reception of God's grace and mercy and love. Okay, I'm not talking about the gospel message here. I'm talking about living the fullness of life with Christ. It comes by loving God and by loving neighbors. My wife recently befriended someone who moved in kitty corner to us, a farmer's wife whose husband died. She's a widow now and moved kitty corner to us in town. And She's lonely. My wife started to have conversations with her. The other day, she was making bean soup for the family, and she made enough to take a batch over to Gail. It's being a good neighbor. There's a need there. Someone lonely. Somebody needs a neighbor. How hard was that for my wife to do? Because sometimes the bigness of the story says, oh boy, it's so hard, I can't do all that. But it's not always big and hard. Sometimes it's a matter of making a little extra and taking it to someone. And is there a certain level of discomfort when my wife walks over to someone's house who she's never met before, really, or she's never knocked on the door before? Sure, there's a level of discomfort and insecurity. Like, I'm going outside my bubble, and maybe she doesn't like bean soup, and maybe she'll say, go away, I don't eat food from other people, or why don't you have a mask on, or you should have, all of these things, right, come at us, and we're like, okay, so I'm not going to do anything. Because it's too scary to leave the security of my bubble. And God's calling us to get out of that bubble, and that means the harvest, the loving of people, often requires us to be really uncomfortable, maybe for just a little bit, until we enter another person's space. And then all of a sudden we go, oh, it's not so bad here. It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. I'm sure glad I took the walk across the street, because now I get to love my neighbor as I love myself. Just as I wrap up here, there's individual application for everybody in the room here, for me, for you. Every one of us has individual application for this. And it's keeping our eyes open and asking, what is the need? How can I help? But then there's also a corporate aspect to this. Now, individually, as you go out into Thief River Falls and you're asking, what's the need? How can I help? You're part of this beautiful thing called the church, and you're representing this church wherever you go. But then there's also, so this is an individual connected to this church and part of this, but then there's also the aspect of this church corporately, as a group, making corporate decisions, community decisions, say, where are we going into our community? What are we going to do together? Each one of us doing our part, individual stuff on your own every day, 24/7, starting in the bedroom, kitchen, out to the workplace, all of that stuff. But what are we going to do together as a people to go into that harvest field, loving God and loving our neighbors? I mean, this thing you're doing with the public schools, that's awesome. That's a great first step. But what else does God ask of you? What might he put on your hearts in the coming months and years? To have this incredible good neighbor experience that the town would say, yeah, that's a good neighbor church.